Now, I have given similar presentations nearby, in fact, over in Columbus, Ohio, and some of you may have attended that. Did anybody get to attend that event at the Fissinger congregation? And so I'm mindful of the fact that you have heard me already speak to the issue, and yet the second session I think you'll find different in that we're going to actually hand out a model policy that Melvin Ote, who is a professor of law at Faulkner University, you may be familiar with. He's also a gospel preacher out of the D.C. area. He worked for nearly 18 years for the Department of Justice as one of the leading experts in organized crime, the RICO statute in the world. And he also was called to be a part of Christian education, and I was fortunate enough as dean to be able to hire him there, and he's working dutifully there. And he last weekend was in Texas. I don't know where he is in this weekend, but he's doing the same thing that I'm doing at other congregations and other locations. And so he and I are working together on a set of bylaws and guidelines and policies, and so we'll share that with you in the second session. There's also an attorney in East Tennessee named Gary Macy, and he has also developed some bylaws and some language that I want to make available to you so that you have a couple of models to go with as you develop something for your own congregation. So the second session is going to be very hands-on. And then the last session is going to sort of make us step back and think about how do we make progress in our ability to minister to people who are struggling with same-sex attraction. And how exactly does the culture that we'll talk about in this first section and the law that we'll talk about in the second session really relate to our ministry? Because at the end of the day, we can't just, nail boards up on the windows and try to pretend the rest of the world it doesn't still need Christ. And we have got to somehow create outreach programs and try to help people overcome what is a very addictive sin. And in order to do that, we're going to have some legal risks and we're going to face some culture wars in the process. But I don't think we give up that fight. So that third session, I think, is perhaps even the most important for your purposes. So let's begin. Let me begin by sharing with you a photo of the Supreme Court of the United States. This is also a photo of the Supreme Court building on the day that the Supreme Court issued its decision, recognizing the constitutional right to marry whoever you choose, was the language the Supreme Court chose to use to define the constitutional right. And that includes same-sex couples being able to get married. And that was the celebration with their gay pride flag banner flying there in the top right-hand corner. Next slide. There's a scripture that I want to refer to in Romans chapters 1 and 2 that I want to spend some time with and in the third session. Or actually, we'll spend some time with chapter 1 in this first session. But I want you to remember that Paul, when he wrote Romans 1, was experiencing some of the same culture challenges as we are today. That every major civilization has developed, has ebbed and flowed, has risen and fallen, and when it's on the decline, there is a great deal of sin in that society that ultimately costs that nation its status in the world. And I think that Paul was very mindful of Rome and the challenges that they had spiritually. And yet he says this in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith," or other translations, faith to faith. "As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." For me, my faith is something that I believe will not only get me to heaven, but hopefully is influencing my family and those that are around me. And as church leaders, I know that your faith has led you to take on a responsibility that will cost you many countless nights' sleep and many tears shed. Thankless job as it is, you're not getting rich being an elder for sure. And so I know that what you're doing is you're trying to use your faith to help shore up others' faith. And I believe that the goal that you have is a righteous one, because I believe that's how God's righteousness is revealed, by our faith being shared with others, and that faith chain being built strong as ever. Now, with that verse in mind, let me just point out a couple of things, what's going on. Next slide. What do wedding caterers in Oregon, this is a bakery up in Oregon. Next slide. Photographers in New Mexico. Next slide. And a judge on the West Coast, who also happens to be an elder and member of the church, all have in common. These are three stories, if you haven't heard them over the last couple of years, that have been picked up in the media, and we could tell countless others. What they have in common, unfortunately, is they're all on the front line of a battlefield. Next slide. They have all been persecuted for standing for what is right. Next slide. And the attacks are continuing. The bakery paid over $350,000 because they refused to bake a cake and put two people of the same sex on top of that cake and help people celebrate the joining together of a same-sex couple in holy matrimony. The photographer paid over $5,000 and tried to pursue her case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denied cert because she didn't want to use her artistic ability to capture the moment of a same-sex wedding for time immemorial. And so as a result of their conscientious objection and not wanting to promote or facilitate or help celebrate something that they believed was sin, the state fined them. And they had to pay a financial price for that. Many people who have taken similar positions have had to pay the ultimate price. They've been run out of business. They've been forced to close by their communities for taking this stand. And as a result, there has been a concerted effort, not only by the government, but by the community, by culture at large, to discourage this kind of free exercise of religion that I believe all of us believe is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And yet, in every level of government, they are being challenged on whether or not they can be a government official, such as the clerk in Kentucky that you heard about this summer, or the judge that I mentioned just a moment ago, or in the private sector, whether you're working for a company who has already gone beyond what the federal law is and adopted a non-discrimination policy and extends full benefits to same-sex couples and doesn't make any distinction based on lifestyle, or if you are in the private sector and you own your own business, you're subjected to this same sort of harassment by the governing regulatory agencies of the state. And I think ultimately by the federal EEOC once the non-discrimination law is extended to all employers and not just federal contractors as it is right now. And so next slide, the attacks are continuing. The adoption agencies in D.C. that were overseen, and in Boston that were overseen by Catholic Charities, had to make a choice. Do you want to hold to your doctrinal position that you think what's best for children is to be placed in a home with a mother and a father? If you do that, then we're not going to let you have an adoption agency. So you need to compromise and allow your children to be placed with same-sex couples too. And if you're not willing to do that, you got to close your door. And it's your choice. And so those adoption agencies chose to close their doors rather than compromise. A faith-based college up in the Northeast, in Massachusetts, Gordon College, was recently challenged by its regional accrediting body because it had a policy that you and I would seem to be very standard for a faith-based school. The policy said that students and faculty are not allowed to have sex outside of a traditional marriage between a man and a woman. And yet they were under scrutiny, not just by the public, but they were under scrutiny by their accrediting agency. And ultimately the accrediting body stood down, but not after sort of suggesting that in a couple of years they may have to revisit the issue. And so for me, that's a telltale sign, because I am one of the vice presidents at Freed Hardeman University. We have 2,000 students. We have married student housing. And we have to think through what is it that God would have us do regarding these issues, and be ready to stand firm on those convictions, regardless of what accrediting bodies or the federal government or others might say. And then the last example I'll give you is the terms mother and father have been replaced in the U.S. passport application, in the FAFSA loans for students wanting to go to college. It's now parent one, parent two, because they don't want to discriminate against folks that have two daddies or two mommies by using the terms mother and father. And those changes are going to have to continue throughout all of the laws, at the state and federal level, over the next year or two, because you'd be surprised how pervasive that kind of language is. Next slide. So I assume you're here today because you're part of an organization that is, if the First Amendment protects anything, it ought to protect what you're doing. You're part of a nonprofit organization that we generally refer to as a church, right? And under the law, the church is given quite a bit of protection to engage in freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of press. You can preach what you want from your pulpit. That's the assumption. And you can advocate and teach what you believe is required by the precepts of the Bible. And yet, there are some that are trying to challenge the church's right to act on its faith. There's a difference, you see, in their mind between you claiming to believe in a holy book that says something that they may not like, or you even teaching it and proclaiming it from a pulpit, and you actually acting on that basis in deciding who you hire, for example, or in deciding who you allow to use your facilities, as a second example. And so there is an effort underfoot to try to force you to compartmentalize your life and the work of the church, and say you can say what you want in your books and in the pulpits, but you can't do what you believe, what you said would logically require you to do to be consistent with that faith. And that compartmentalization, they don't see any problem with it. I'm going to share with you in, I think, the third session, a quote from the Vice Chancellor of Vanderbilt, who adopted what is called an all-comers policy for students. And it basically requires student organizations that are faith-based, like a student club or organization for Christians, to allow non-Christians to join their membership. Not only join, but actually run for office and be the president. So an atheist or a Buddhist is required under Vanderbilt policy and under many state schools policies to be permitted to run for office and be a member of a Christian student organization. Otherwise, that student organization doesn't get officially recognized on campus, loses all of its funding. And I've been curious about what was the rationale. So this afternoon, I want to show you exactly what the chancellor's rationale is for that policy. And his rationale is he believes that he has to compartmentalize his faith. He's Catholic. And he cannot, he says, you don't want me to make decisions for this university based on my faith, do you? As if that would be ludicrous for him to actually act consistent with his beliefs, right? And he says, therefore, you need young people, students, to learn how to compartmentalize your life in a similar fashion. That is scary, but it's scariest of all if you're talking about it in the church context, in the congregational context, where we can't walk what we talk. Now, ministers also have been targeted because in Canada and Europe and other places, you can be fined for holding up the wrong sign that happens to quote a scripture that would condemn homosexuality. For example, as a street preacher was fined in London just recently. Or you can be fined for promoting anything that would offend people that have certain lifestyles that are habitually engaging in what the Bible teaches as sin, because that's hateful. And that can be labeled as a hate crime. So it's not only a civil fine, but a criminal sanction that you can face in other common law countries like Canada. And so that hasn't made it here yet in full form, but I think it is an increasing risk, and it's certainly a risk in certain jurisdictions. Now, next slide. We know the problem. The problem is that we live in a culture which is now sanctioning what Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 condemn. For this reason, Paul said, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those who are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts, so dishonorable passions, shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. This is a passage that very plainly is condemning as sinful the homosexual lifestyle. And yet there are still many religious groups that pretend that God's not been clear on this issue, or that it's just an Old Testament problem, and it's not prohibited in the New Testament. I don't know how else to read this passage, except that it is, in fact, condemning homosexual lifestyles and engaging in homosexual sexual activity. Now, if that's right, if that's clearly what the Bible teaches, this and other passages, and you have an obligation as the pillar of truth, as the church, to teach the truth in season and out of season, and demand through church discipline fidelity to the truth of your members, how is it that we reconcile that obligation with the legal pressure to whitewash this activity and treat it? And how is it that we got so far, given the fact that we, are considered a Christian nation, built by founders who shared our values in large measure? And how did we get so far from the point where there'd be any doubt whether there'd be any limitation on a church acting consistent with its beliefs in this regard? Let me suggest a couple of things. Here's the Supreme Court decision. And I think the best way to think about the Supreme Court decision is to understand that it was a close decision, not unlike Roe v. Wade and other decisions that are controversial. It was 5-4. It was decided, and the 5 justices that voted in favor of it, go to the next slide, the 5 justices that voted in favor of it, Kennedy, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Breyer, and Ginsburg, were very plain in what they were advocating. They really ignored a lot of social science. They ignored a lot of the reasons that were given to not extend marriage rights. But ultimately, they decided that the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to a same-sex marriage in Obergefell v. Hodges. Now, when they did that, go to the next slide, they not only invalidated the same-sex marriage bans in Ohio, Tennessee, Michigan, and Kentucky as violating both the Equal Protection and the Due Process Clause. And what that meant was all those states, and they were not the only states, there were several more states, at least 10 more, that had actually passed laws saying marriage is only between a man and a woman. And they invalidated that and said you cannot limit marriage to just between a man and a woman under the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. They then took it a step further and redefined what God created, what every civilization has recognized for thousands of years, that marriage is between a man and a woman who can procreate and continue the human race and that are biologically complementary. And they ignored all of that and what's best for raising children, and instead redefined marriage on their own in a very tyrannical judicial act of tyranny, in my opinion, to include in the definition of marriage joining opposite and same-sex couples. And so ultimately, it was based on what they called the, quote, right to personal choice regarding marriage. Now, let me stop there and ask you a question. Next slide. Does anybody believe that you have the right to marry whoever you want? I don't even think the Supreme Court believed what they wrote there. All you got to do is throw a couple of examples at them. Do 2 kissing cousins have the right to marry? It's personal choice to marry whomever you want, I thought. What about 3 people? They all love each other. They want to work together and as a unit. Do they have the personal choice to marry each other and engage in polygamy? If not, why not? Supreme Court gave absolutely no legal reason why they would limit the holding to a couple. They just asserted this is just for couples. But that's the only reason why you limit it to couples is because that's part of God's model. There's no legal or social reason to limit it to couples. And so I believe that distinction will fall by the wayside sooner as opposed to later, and polygamy will be legal in this country too, under the principle that you have the constitutional right to marry whomever you want. And you can take it obviously to the nth degree, but you get the idea. I believe that the Supreme Court has authored a 100-page opinion based on a bad principle of law that they themselves don't believe and are not prepared to defend to the nth degree. Now, regardless, it is the supreme law of the land. I think, though, it's important that we understand how we got here. Next slide. How do you get to that extreme? Well, the book of Romans suggests that the first step is you suppress the truth. Listen to Romans chapter 1, verse 18. Next slide. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. You know, the first step to the fall of great nations is not that they immediately start out in the most extreme forms of debauchery. The first step is that they are God-given a moral conscience. They have a sense of right and wrong that you have to suppress that. You have to, with a hot branding iron, sear that conscience, as Timothy was told by Paul. And that process takes some time and effort. You've got to engage in a sin habitually to sort of change those pathways in your brain to the point that it seems natural. And what happens is that first step is so critical, but it's so silent that we don't realize it's happening all the time. The suppression of the truth. Now, I want to give you examples straight from the Supreme Court's opinion, the 100-page opinion, just to give you an example of how the court, I believe, was guilty of contributing to this suppression of truth. Here's 3 quotes. Next slide. Until the mid-20th century, same-sex intimacy, the Supreme Court says, long had been condemned as immoral. This is on page 7 of the opinion. What strikes you about that statement? That it's in past tense. And here is 5 judges, not religious figures, making a statement about what's immoral and not immoral. They didn't say illegal or unlawful. They said what's immoral. And they said it had been immoral. Look at the next statement. Homosexuality was treated as an illness, a mental disorder, a position adhered to until 1973, page 7. Again, they're not doctors. There's no footnote to prove that homosexuality, you're born homosexual. There's no medical evidence to support that yet. And yet they are saying it's no longer an illness. It's now a normal expression of sexuality. They assert it without any documentation whatsoever. Again, supposedly in the role as judges, not as the medical community and not as the religious community. Third, they're suppressing the truth, though, when it comes to religious truth, when it comes to medical truth. Third one, the limitation of marriage to opposite-sex couples may long have seemed natural and just or fair, but now they're not. It doesn't make sense to limit it to same-sex couples. Really? Is there social science? Is there empirical studies that suggest it's not in the best interest of children, that it's not for the good of society to limit marriage between a man and a woman, that hey, maybe people can do whatever they want to do in the sexual revolution that we live in post-1960s? But as far as what society should be promoting, what society should give a tax credit for and encourage, you're telling me there's no good reason, there's no just reason to limit it to opposite-sex couples? Is there some footnotes here? No footnotes. Just an assertion. They're suppressing the truth. Let me unpack that a little bit for you so you have a sense of it. I believe next slide, what they're doing is they're redefining the ordinary meaning of the words. They're ignoring basic biology and sexual complementarity. They're ignoring the social science. On this point, let me just give you one example. Next slide. Let me encourage you to remember 3 numbers when it comes to the social science. There was a study performed by a professor at the University of Texas, Mark Regenis. And this study was the most careful, rigorous, and methodologically sound study ever conducted on the issue of children raised by homosexual parents. And the outcome for the children of homosexual parents was rated, according to this person who was not coming at it from a faith-based standpoint, just from a scientific standpoint, the outcome for children of homosexuals was rated suboptimal, below what's optimal in every category the study looked at. He analyzed 59 previous studies and found that some of them found that it was no big deal, that homosexuals could raise children just as well as heterosexual couples. And yet, when he looked at those studies, he found of those 59, only 4 met the APA guidelines, the American Psychological Association's guidelines for conducting a proper statistical study. None of them compared a large random sample, representative sample of lesbian or gay parents and their children to a large random representative sample of married parents and their children like they should have from a scientific standpoint. They were skewing their data to get the conclusions they wanted. But when you take a large sample of gay parents and a large sample of opposite sex couples' parents, and you compare the data like he did, what you find are these 3 numbers. And the bottom line, the first number is 2. And this is a tragic number. This is the number of children in homes, what are called biologically intact homes, where they live with their mom and their dad. 2% of children living with their biological mom and dad are subjected to child abuse, sexual molestation, physical sexual molestation every year in this country. 2%. That is a horrific number. But that number goes up to 10% if you take away the mom or the dad and you let them get raised by a single parent, specifically a single mom. How is that? What would explain that? Well, the study went into a lot of details, but some of the examples were if the single mother was single, then she tended to date, and there would be a lot more strange men coming in and out of that home and spend the night over and that sort of thing, and things would happen. Now, I'm not trying to fault the single mother. I'm trying to ask ourselves as a society, which one should we promote? Should we promote families staying together and staying intact? Or should we promote, don't bother even get married, shack up, have kids, keep going your own ways, because one woman can raise a child as well as a husband and a wife? You see the point? And the social science says you will create 5 times the problems for the children if you don't support biologically intact homes. But then I have to ask you, what do you think that last number represents? That's a same-sex couple raising the children. The percentage of child molestation goes up to 23%. And so I'm just wondering, when this study was provided to the U.S. Supreme Court in an amicus briefs, why they would just assert that homosexual couples can provide caring homes for children and raise them just as well as biologically intact families can, and not try to refute or respond to Mark's study. I don't have a good answer for you, except that they had already made up in their mind what they wanted the decision to be, and it was a political decision. And they then made the law fit it, as well as the social science, ignoring it or twisting it. Now, that's enough of the social science. Let me move back to the law where I feel a little bit more comfortable, because what happens is there's a progression. If you're trying to take an entire culture into a habitual sin, first you suppress the truth, whether it's religious truth or medical truth or scientific truth. And then the second step, next slide, is that you exchange the truth for a lie. And let me read this verse. This is Romans chapter 1, verses 24 and 25 while he gets to that slide. God, it says, gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the created, the creature, rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Now, I can give you several examples of that. This is from the opinion again. Here's a quote on page 8. Only in more recent years have psychiatrists and others recognized that sexual orientation is both a normal expression of human sexuality and immutable. So what was the first step? First step is to say, nobody believes that it's an illness anymore, and suppress the truth, because there's a great deal of evidence out there saying they need psychotherapy. Bruce Jenner is not just courageous. He is sick. He needs help. And yet the world is just patting him on the back and saying, great job. We're glad that you're now considering yourself a female and you're so courageous to talk about it on national TV. That's suppressing the truth. He is a very disturbed man and needs help. But then the second step comes along, and they not only suppress the truth, but they want to switch it into a lie. And they want you to believe the lie, that it's a normal expression of human sexuality for him, who he's not even homosexual. Most psychologists who are willing to talk frankly about what they believe Bruce Jenner's problem is, most of them would say he wants to pretend to be a woman because he is so obsessed with women that he can't get satisfaction just by having relations with one woman after another like he's done in the past. He has to actually be a woman so he can constantly be sexually stimulated by it. So that, there are some problems there that that are way over my pay grade to understand. But to talk about people that are struggling, and you probably, I can ask for a show of hands, I know of a number of people that struggle with same-sex attraction. My dad comes from a very large family of Catholics. He was converted at a very young age when I was 2 years old. And yet none of his other brothers and sisters were converted. And of those aunts and uncles, my favorite is the youngest. And she has done tremendous things for me. And she is one of the head nurses at one of the largest hospitals in Memphis. And I'm very proud of her professional accomplishments. But she has a relationship with a female doctor at that hospital. And so I'm speaking about this issue with as much love in my heart as I can possibly muster. But at the same time, I can't say that's natural or normal. There's no medical evidence for this statement that it's a normal expression of human sexuality and immutable. Do you understand what the word immutable means? This is immutable. The color of my skin is immutable. If you are black or you are white, that is immutable. You're born that way. But there is no evidence, not a single shred of biological evidence that Bruce Jenner was born the way he thinks he is. That is something that is a combination, a very complex combination of certain personality traits and characteristics as well as certain environmental factors. I'm not suggesting to you I can explain to you how people get into such a rut and such a downward spiral in life. I'm just suggesting to you that the court has no basis whatsoever to assume it's like the color of skin. Except for political purposes, they want to make that parallel so they extend all the civil rights that have been extended to the black community to the homosexual community. There's no evidence, no footnote on this sentence of the opinion that explains why they believe it's immutable. And yet they assert it, and they're trying to get you to believe the lie. Look at the next quote there. Not the slide, but same slide. There has been a shift in public attitudes towards greater tolerance. Well, that's true. The last one, gays and lesbians can create loving, supportive families. And I believe that you can, with the right circumstances, find examples that from all outward appearances, from any objective measurement even, the child is completely well-adjusted and completely in a loving, supportive family, even if he's being raised by a same-sex couple. But the problem is, statistically, and I showed you the statistics a minute ago, that is not the case. There is no reliable evidence that supports that. And for the court to jump into this game and just assert this with no social science evidence, and to in fact ignore the evidence that was given to them, is a dangerous way to sort of lead our country in a direction that has yet to be proven. Now, regardless of putting aside what the Bible says, Let me show you the next quote so you can get a sense of what I mean when I say they're trying to get us, they're turning the truth on its head and trying to get you to believe the lie. Listen to this quote directly from the opinion. Excluding same-sex couples from marriage thus conflicts with a central premise of the right to marry. Now, we've already established there is no absolute right to marry whoever you want. They keep asserting it, and they're going to rue the day that they did that, because polygamy is next, bestiality. Where do you stop? Okay, pedophilia. Where do you stop? But here we keep reading. Without the recognition, stability, and predictability marriage offers. So those are the three things that traditional marriage offers. But watch what they'll do. Their children, talking about same-sex couples' children, suffer the stigma of knowing their families are somehow lesser. Now, wait a minute. I thought they are just as, well-adjusted. I thought children can be raised in loving, supportive families and everything's just fine. But they recognize that, in fact, everything's not fine. Those kids are psychologically being damaged, and yet they're not going to blame the choices of their parents. They're going to blame society. You see it? They're going to blame the community for giving them such a hard time. So the stigma of knowing their families are somehow lesser. They also suffer the significant material costs of being raised by unmarried parents, relegated through no fault of their own to a more difficult and uncertain family life. Is it uncertain because everybody in the community is being so hateful to them? Or is it uncertain because statistically gay couples break up and get back with multiple-fold time more sex partners than heterosexual couples? What's the uncertainty? Is the uncertainty the sin of the parents, or is the uncertainty the sin of being of the teachers and the people in the community that might interact with those students being mean to them? But the court doesn't parse that. The court puts all the blame on society's decision to have marriage limited to a man and a woman, and tries to use that as the explanation for why children of homosexual couples have suffered and been stigmatized and feel that they are somehow lesser in a family that's lesser. The last sentence makes this plain. I'm not just extrapolating this. The marriage laws at issue here thus harm and humiliate the children of same-sex couples. The shame and the unnatural sexual perversion of their parents doesn't harm and humiliate the children. The law in Tennessee that says marriage is between a man and a woman, that's what did it. You see what the court's doing? They are exchanging the truth for a lie and getting you to believe it. Now, that's throughout the 100-page opinion. I encourage you to quote it. Next slide. Read it. I just want to quickly tell you, though, that they see the value of marriage. Everybody does. It is special. What God created, what He instituted from the very beginning is a very powerful institution. And here's some quotes that underscore that. They said that marriage is sacred. The Supreme Court says. It offers unique fulfillment. It is essential to our most profound hopes and aspirations. There are untold references to the beauty of marriage in religious texts. The petitioners seek marriage for themselves because of their respect and need for its privileges and responsibilities. Through its enduring bond, two persons can find expression, intimacy, and spirituality, whatever their sexual orientation. Last one, it offers the hope of companionship and understanding and assurance that while both still live, there will be someone. Don't you find it odd that He takes all of these blessings of marriage as God's defined it, including blessings like sacredness and spirituality and personal fulfillment? You with me? But just stick with spirituality. And they steal that and suppress the fact that it's tied fundamentally to God's design. If you want to get some spiritual benefit, then you need to do it God's way. Amen? And yet, they steal that from God's design and then try to transport it over to man's new design for marriage and say, yeah, if you could do marriage, as long as you call it marriage, even though it's something that God would call an abomination, if you call it marriage, then you just automatically, all these benefits, all these blessings, that spirituality, that sacredness, that hope, that beauty, it all just automatically transfers because we called sin marriage. Is that any kind of way for the leading jurist in the country to reason? Does that make any sense whatsoever? Except they're trying to get you to believe a lie. One last quote. No union is more profound, talking about marriage, than marriage. For it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, two people, see how they keep stressing two people? And they say in their opinion, they're limiting this opinion to two people's right to get married, not three, because they don't want to go to polygamy, but there's no reason not to. But two people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. The audacity. Not only do they corrupt what God has created, they then try to imply that once you take on for yourself this corrupt human form of marriage of same-sex couples, that you could still enjoy that in the afterlife. Now, that kind of twisted thinking, where they're trying to impute the spiritual benefits of a marriage in the eyes of God to a marriage in the eyes of the Supreme Court, is, I believe, classic example of trying to exchange the truth of God for a lie and to worship the created rather than the creator. Now, last step. Romans talks about, next slide, Romans talks about how the third step for a society to fully give birth to this kind of habitual sin is to give approval to those who practice such things. Romans 1:32, next slide. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. And next slide, here's what the Supreme Court did. It gives them approval. Quote, gays have a just claim to dignity. Quote, they ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law, and the Constitution grants them that right. They're approving. So step 1, suppress the truth. Step 2, exchange it for a lie. And step 3, approve of those who engage in that lie. Next slide is a long slide, and it's one that I can't spend as much time as I'd like trying to explain it to you, but let me just say this. What's happening in the Supreme Court with regard to same-sex marriage is not new in this regard. They do not respect the authority of the U.S. Constitution. You can understand this because as elders in the church, you've been having to deal with a religious world that doesn't respect the authority of your authoritative text, the Bible. They are not limited to the Word. They are willing to add or take away from the U.S. Constitution like many religious groups are willing to do to the Bible. And so the same hermeneutics that have led to false doctrine in the church are also being used by lawyers and judges to lead to very disturbing conclusions that the Founding Fathers in a million years wouldn't have believed the U.S. Constitution supported. And this is just one example. In fact, I would say it's the culmination of several cases that the Supreme Court have decided over the last several decades. It began innocent enough, unless you were Catholic. And that was that married couples in the privacy of their bedroom ought to have the right to decide whether to use contraception or not. And as you know, the Catholic Church believes that's sinful. And yet, the Supreme Court said, no, we do not believe that, we believe that a married couple gets to decide for themselves whether to use contraception. That was called Griswold in 1965. Now, even if you agree with that decision, watch what the Supreme Court does in a succession of cases to get to where we are today. Just a few years later, they extended that same right. Remember, equal protection of the laws. And so if a married couple has the fundamental right, you understand what a fundamental right, you know how they get this stuff in the Constitution? Let me back up. The Constitution protects rights. Generally, the government can enforce laws on you as long as they give you due process. As long as those laws have enough checks and balances and you got a legal recourse to be able to challenge those laws, they can limit you. They can limit how fast you drove here today. They can limit the size of that exit sign and the wattage behind it and how often you have to put an exit sign up in this room. They can limit a lot of things, right? Limit your rights. But they have to give you due process. But the Supreme Court has said, if that's true, and it is under the Constitution, that, you have the right to life, liberty. You have the rights that cannot be, that the court has to give you due process of law before they take away your rights. All right? Great. Fifth Amendment applies to the state under the 14th Amendment. But they said if that's true, that there are certain rights that require certain levels of process, then more important rights require even more processes. And that's true. They're going to put you to death and kill you, take away your right to live, then they have a lot more process they got to go through. It takes forever to put somebody to death in this country, right? That's because due process is required under the Constitution. But then they just got this bright idea that if some rights require a little process and more important rights require even more process, then theoretically there are some rights that are so fundamental that there's no amount of process that you can go through before you can take them away. So there's some rights that are fundamental rights that can't be taken away. And they're not even written in the Constitution, but they're just as important as the stuff written in the Constitution. And this bright idea is why that's what led to these Supreme Court cases that you see here. And one of those rights, one of the first ones to be recognized was Griswold. A fundamental right for a married couple to decide whether to use contraception in the marriage bed. That is so fundamental, no amount of process can take away that right. I can buy that one. You with that one? Everybody okay with that one? That is pretty intimate. And from a society standpoint, the marriage bed is, from a religious standpoint, marriage bed is undefiled before God, right? All right, so stay with me. But then the Equal Protection Clause kicks in. And if a married couple gets to decide whether to use contraception, then so should anybody else, including single people, unmarried people. You get it? So society is promoting marriage with or without contraception. Now, society's best interest is marriage, promoting children and raising children in good married homes, but we'll give you some control over that with contraception. That's fine. But then the next step is now society is in the business of having to promote the sexual revolution and people having premarital sex because it's a fundamental right and no amount of process can stop a child from having sex with another child in the back of a Chevy. Huh? How do we get there? Well, maybe if they're a minor, the Constitution doesn't give them the same rights. But once they're an adult, absolutely the right. You with me? Our society made a big jump from something that was consistent with our religion and our faith and social goals to something that everybody was going head scratcher, but it's because the logic of the Supreme Court said equal protection, you have to apply the same rule to everybody regardless of their marital status. You with me? So they get another fundamental right, which is the second case. Then they get to the third case. So you want to know how in this country we get to the point where we're killing millions and millions of unborn children in this country every year? It's simple logic. If you have the right to decide whether or not to have babies using contraception as a married couple or as a single couple, then as that single woman who gets impregnated, they ought to have the right to terminate. It's just another form of contraception. Just a little baby step in logic. You see it? If you have the right, and that right is no longer defined as intimacy in the marriage bed, it's defined as just the right to sex and controlling sex, then you can control the entire process from conception to birth. And that fundamental right is so fundamental, the laws can't take it away in any extent. Roe v. Wade, you have the right to an abortion. Then you take it one more step in Romer v. Evans. And that is the people of Colorado tried to pass an amendment to their state constitution that said, you know what, you cannot, we as a society know what's best for our society, and we do not want to be promoting anything except traditional marriage between a man and a woman. So we want to go ahead and put into our Constitution that no future legislature can ever pass a law legalizing homosexuality. You with me? Well, the court said, no, you can't predetermine that. You have to let homosexuals in the future become the majority, theoretically, and make the law however they want. Because you're talking about laws regarding sexuality, and there's this fundamental right to sex. It started out as a fundamental right to something that we all hold, including God, holds as honorable, the marriage bed, the marriage between a man and a woman. And now it's gotten just to a free-for-all to have sex however you want it, and including homosexuality. And so Lawrence v. Texas came along and declared there's a fundamental right of gays and lesbians to engage in private, consensual homosexual activity, just like Griswold said married people get to do. That's how we got there. And so once Lawrence was decided, this case was done. This case was no surprise to anybody that knew their constitutional law. Now, the reason why I'm concerned about it is that slippery slope that we're on is not finished yet, as I've alluded to with the possibility of polygamy and that sort of thing. Go to the next case. This is the last slide, then we'll take a small break, and we'll get into how to develop some policies to address this. I want to remind you that the Obergefell decision does not prevent you from teaching the truth. From this pulpit, you can preach and advocate whatever you want. Even the majority court upheld that right. It also doesn't prevent you from engaging in what God joins together, which is a wedding, which I believe is an inherently religious experience. In this country, we marry the religious and the civil. And as preachers, how many preachers do we have here today? Several. You've got the authority vested in you by the state, right, to pronounce them man and wife. So you're not just recognizing that God is joining them together, you're also putting on another hat and acting as an agent of the state. And that's where it gets problematic, because a state could put conditions on that license, that authority. But for now, you have the right to marry who you believe, consistent with your beliefs who you believe should be married before God, and not marry those who aren't. And I don't think we need to run from that space. So we need to find, and these policies are going to help you do it, find a legal way to create enough space for us to continue to have marriages performed in our wedding, in our buildings, church buildings, by our ministers, without risking being sued by same-sex couples wanting you to perform their wedding as well, even though you believe God has no hand in joining them together. You with me? That's the challenge, and we'll talk about it in the next session. But the third thing is it doesn't require us to facilitate or assist same-sex marriages yet. And I add yet because there's going to be a series of cases that are going to define, what are the conditions of you as a minister having a license from the state. The state may say, if we're going to license you to do opposite-sex couple marriages, you've got to agree to do same-sex marriage couples, otherwise you got to get out of the business altogether. Or the state may define this church building as a place of public accommodation, not unlike a civic center, and say, if you're going to let the Girl Scouts come in here and use this building, if you're going to let this be used as a voting precinct, if you're going to let this building be used for various other groups beyond just your worship service, then you can't discriminate among those groups, because you're a place of public accommodation and you'd be discriminating. And that would be a violation of the non-discrimination laws that many cities and states have already passed, and the federal government is likely to pass in the next year. So right now, you're not required in this city, as far as I know, to use this building to facilitate a same-sex wedding. Then the last one is it does not prevent us from helping those struggling with same-sex attraction. And that'll be our afternoon session on how we can do that.